Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our session titled The Role of Faith-Inspired Giving and Faith-Based Organizations to Restore Nature. Amal leads a series of talks in the format of podcast episodes offering perspectives at the nexus of philanthropy, impact investments, and social and climate innovation, in collaboration with Catalyst 2030, a World Economic Forum initiative and network comprising leading social enterprises, intermediaries, and funders. Today, we'll be diving into the fascinating ways that faith and nature intersect. Did you know that faith-based organizations own and manage over 5% of forests, making them some of the largest nature-based landowners and stewards on the planet? It's also fascinating that faith-inspired giving contributes billions of dollars each year towards nature conservation, reforestation, and afforestation activities, and other environmental initiatives. But it's not just about the numbers. See, the link between faith and nature runs deep, with many religious traditions emphasizing the sacredness of nature and humanity's responsibility to care for it. In this episode, we'll be exploring how faith-based organizations are restoring nature, promoting environmental sustainability, and tackling climate change. From grassroots regenerative farming to interfaith collaborations on environmental issues, there is a wealth of inspiring examples to explore. So join us as we explore this important topic and discover the powerful ways that faith and nature contribute to the betterment of the world and how inextricably linked they are. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists for today, starting with Dan Perel, United Nations representative from the Baha'i International Community, Karimi Kinoti, Director of Special Projects, Kristen Aid, Iyad Abu Mughli, Director of Faith for Earth Coalition from UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program. So to kick it off, we would love you to please tell us more about your organization, the work you do, and how it relates to faith and nature.
It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to learning from the wisdom of Karimi and Iyad as well. So perhaps just very briefly, the Baha'i International Community's United Nations Office, which I have the pleasure to represent, engages in international fora and serves to represent the worldwide Baha'i community, whose over 8 million members come from every national, ethnic, religious, cultural, and socioeconomic background, representing a true cross-section of humanity. It's our role at these international fora to contribute the experience from Baha'i communities and their collaborators and friends, as well as guidance from the Baha'i writings to the prevalent discourses of society at the international level. We are, as a matter of faith, instructed to be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age in which we live, and to center our deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. Another passage that helps to guide our work is that nature is God's will, and its expression in and through the contingent world. So it's no surprise that we, as the Baha'i International Community, are and have been engaged in these conversations around humanity's relationship with the natural world, dating back to the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, right up to today, as well as individual and local community actions, even prior to the existence of the United Nations, and perhaps, without saying too much, beyond its existence, should that day come.
Christian Aid is the humanitarian and development agency of 41 what we call sponsoring churches in Britain and Ireland. And we work with partners, local partners, churches, other faith communities, NGOs across South America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. So we are truly global in our perspective. So we support communities, and it's important for you to know that it's not directly, it's through local partners, support communities who are affected by disasters, and increasingly these are climate-related disasters. We also work on sustainable development and campaign on global issues relating to sustainable development. We're very much motivated by our faith. And even though we are a faith-based organization rooted in the churches, we work across all people with shared values and communities for the betterment of our life on earth. Some of the projects that we are involved in include regenerative agriculture, environmental conservation. We are keen to know how communities view life. And so, for instance, with indigenous communities around water as a source of life and protecting wetlands and pitlands in South America, and looking at the integrity of the whole of natural ecosystems. So in communities and countries around Africa, for example, the whole challenge of food, droughts, floods, and how food is produced is quite important to us. So the areas of agroecology and regenerative agriculture. As I mentioned, we also campaign and advocate because we believe, yes, we can do practical action and mobilize, but it's also important to influence political systems, economic systems towards more of the regeneration, the restoration of natural ecosystems. My own role currently as Special Projects Director is to help the organization strengthen our work with faith partnerships. And I have also previously been the Global Policy and Campaigns Director and head of the Africa Division. So faith and nature is core to our work with communities across the world who are affected by climate change and biodiversity loss. And we draw on our faith, understanding of what it means to love our neighbor, which includes the natural world and how we care for it.
It's a pleasure to be with my friends, Karimi and Dan. And it's a pleasure to be with you on this podcast. Probably you know that the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, is the highest level authority within the UN system on the environment. And UNEP is responsible for the environmental pillar of sustainable development with economy and social development. Our main responsibility is to keep the environment under review, to assess the state of the global environment, and to develop policies and strategies, of course, with member states being represented at the United Nations Environment Assembly, which is constituted of 193 member states and countries, as the highest level governance system on environmental issues. Of course, our work depends on the relationship between science and policy. So we focus as the UN and in particular UNEP on the triple planetary crisis, including climate change, nature degradation, and pollution and waste. Our work is focusing on environmental governance. We have started engaging with faith-based organizations and faith actors as UNEP in the early 80s. And in the 90s, we launched the Spiritual or Green Sabbath, which was an initiative in the United States and North America. But then later on, we published what was called the Faith and Earth publication, highlighting the role of religions on environmental issues. In the 2000s, we have held a number of conferences, but after the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, we held the following year in 2016 an international conference in Tehran on the relationship of religions and culture in environmental issues and sustainable development. And the following year, in 2017, the Faith for Earth initiative and the strategic engagement with faith-based organizations has started as a solid program within UNEP, working with its different divisions, different priority areas and programs and regional offices with three main important goals. The first goal, looking at the nature of UNEP, which is a policy science platform, is to engage faith actors and high-level faith leaders in policy dialogue through the United Nations Environment Assembly. And we have had 3 of them so far. And we created what we call the Faith for Earth Dialogue, where hundreds of faith actors participate, representing dozens of religions and contributing to the discussions of the resolutions and decisions that are made and adopted by the UN Environment Assembly. Not only at the UN Environment Assembly, but also we facilitate policy dialogue during other multilateral environmental agreements, such as UNFCCC, such as the CBD on biodiversity, and so on and so forth. Because UNEP does manage 13 of these multilateral environmental agreements. The second objective of the Faith for Earth Coalition is to work on bridging the knowledge and science and the teachings of religions, what the religions are saying in terms of climate change, in terms of biodiversity, and so on. We match that, or we sense it with what the science and the scientific reports are saying. For example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPBES for biodiversity, and so on. So we prepare the backbone of engagement from a religious and scientific point of view. And the final goal is working with faith organizations to greening their financing and investments. You mentioned that they own 5% of commercial forests, but also they own 8% of habitable land on Earth. And they own more than 50% of schools and universities. And they own massive assets in terms of houses of worship. There are hundreds of millions of houses of worship around the world. So greening those assets is very important. And we have been working with organizations to contribute or to make their contributions to sustainable development green and as a way of financing sustainable development. So this is in a nutshell what Faith for Earth has been doing and what is the focus of our program.
I think our audience is now more clear on the nature of your work and how it relates to faith and nature. I want to pick up where Dr. Iyad left, which is the amount of assets that faith-based organizations have and their influence on nature and their contributions to environmental efforts. So my question to the panelists is how and what unique contributions can faith-based organizations make to environmental restoration efforts? How can they leverage their networks and resources to create an impact? There are many examples, from engaging their communities and congregations to participate in some of these initiatives, encouraging sustainable practices within their own operations, from efficient lighting to effective irrigation systems to reducing waste, etc., to investing financial resources from their endowments into nature restoration projects, among other areas.
To me, when we're speaking about making an impact on environmental restoration, I think there are at least two levels, but I'll speak of two, that the faith-based communities and faith-based organizations can have. One level, the perhaps surface level, to be maybe more crude than I should be, are the various projects that faith-based organizations and communities can encourage and promote, and the menu of options provided. This is elements like greening of a faith space, or the use of solar panels, or a community garden. These sort of outward expressions of a commitment, a deeper commitment to environmental conservation and restoration. And these are absolutely vital. But to me, they are something that all of us should be doing. Whether it's a large private sector company or a government or a neighborhood or a faith-based organization, all of them should be taking these sort of actions, the outward expression. What I find fascinating and exciting about the role of faith itself is this deeper level, this deeper contribution that it can have to a community and to its congregants, followers, and then friends and neighbors who see this example. And maybe I can liken this to the UN's often used term transformation. I hear transformation spoken of very highly at international levels, and as it should be. We, as a global community, have to transform not only the outward activities that we take, but our inner understanding of what it means to be a human being in the 21st century, what it means to live with the current crises that we see around us. And this is a transformation that is very difficult to induce. And if I were asked, where do you see transformation? It's often in the faith-based community where you have an individual. I can speak firsthand. I mean, this is my own experience. When I was in university, I behaved in such a way that my wife tells me today she would probably not have even been friends with me. I learned about the Baha'i faith after I graduated, and I have committed myself to its principles in a way that has transformed my approach. Of course, I still have much learning to do, much growth to experience, but I'm a different person. That is transformation. And I think the faith-based community can speak to this deeper level that is required for all of humanity at this moment in history. It has the power to change hearts and to change behavior, to inspire communities to then find their own solutions. If you have that transformation, it's essentially the old adage of teaching someone to fish rather than giving them a fish. I would liken the installation of solar panels to the giving of a fish. But the underlying transformation of individuals and communities is teaching them to do so, because then they can devise their own solutions that are suited to their needs and capacities. And I think in this sense, the faith-based organizations act as catalysts or as leaven for change, in addition, of course, to being that example of the change itself. And I think that transformation is where the conversation needs to go, because isolated examples of projects are wonderful and helpful, but they don't get to the underlying illness. They treat many of the symptoms, and we have to treat these symptoms. But the underlying disease is far more profound. And that is something that all holy texts, all religions and faiths speak to. And I think that is where many faith-based organizations have a distinct contribution to make. And it's what excites me about this space.
I think when we talk about faith communities and faith-based organizations, what is central is the values, the spiritual, the faith values and principles, and the understanding of how that helps to explain the world. And in this case, when we're talking about nature, and certainly from the Christian faith, we would be talking about God as creator and what we see around us across the world as creation. So the mandate and the understanding from the faith around how do you care for creation and the responsibility that has been given to human beings. Yes, we are part of creation, but we have a responsibility, which is a stewardship responsibility. And you know, the difference between being a steward, somebody who cares for something that has been put into our care, as opposed to an owner. And so that idea of stewardship, the idea of, from a spiritual, a faith perspective, of a moral responsibility. Okay, so it is a mandate, it's a moral responsibility to care for the whole of creation. And to also understand that we are dependent on nature. We can't be separated from nature. All right. So the caring side of it that is of mutual benefit to both human beings as well as the diversity of creation and of nature. So I think that the spiritual values are extremely important in the way that faith-based organizations approach the issues that we are discussing. And with that, of course, is the holistic understanding of life and the interconnectedness, that everything connects with everything else, and together there is a thriving. And where there is disorder, in this case with biodiversity loss or with the climate change and the impacts of climate change, there is something wrong with what really should be working well together for all parts of creation. Faith leaders and faith actors can be very influential in society. And we've seen that before, where on an issue, and one that comes to mind is Jubilee 2000 with the debt cancellation, there was a huge mobilizing of movements, local, national, global movements that political actors could not ignore. And so faith-based organizations, faith actors have, where they have the moral authority and the influence, the ability to mobilize their congregations, communities, even other civil society organizations. And that comes from their reach. You know, the churches, Ihad was talking about the houses of worship, millions of them across churches, mosques, temples, in communities, but also how that links into different parts of society at national level and at global level. And the access that has, particularly for faith leaders, to those who hold power, who can change policy, and to those who make decisions. And finally, I would say, not least, is culture change. Because where we are with what we see with climate change and with biodiversity loss and the impacts, the environmental degradation, there's something about the culture. There's something about how we understand our relationship to nature that is broken. And so there is something there about community transformation, so doing things differently. So there's the practical action around that and the ripple effect that has across societies and the globe. But I think importantly, it starts with creating awareness. And that in itself is about unlearning, relearning, or completely learning new ways of working, new ways of relating that, as I shared earlier, is of a holistic nature that in our faith particularly is around stewardship and what we call the creation care.
Let me build on the beautiful contributions of Karimi and Dan, and also mention that, look at religions. They have existed for centuries, some of them as old as 5,000 years old. And those values that Karimi mentioned have been progressively driving behaviors of the people over centuries. And all religions have progressed in their teachings and in their understandings of life and nature as we deal with it. So adding to that, let me take that to the higher level of the powers of faith organizations and faith institutions and religions themselves, whether they are structured religions or non-structured religions. The convincing power that these religions have, any religion relies on or teaches about, is in a sacred script. The Old Testament, the Holy Bible, the Quran, and so on and so forth. And these textbooks actually cannot be debated by their followers. Yeah, you might find somebody who believes in the holistic approach of the religion and others believe in some parts, but in general, these sacred books are being respected and have the convincing power of the people. So imagine if you talk to a group of people and tell them the scientific report of the IPCC says this and that. They might immediately debate and say, well, it's an agenda. How did you follow the methodology, the scientific methodology? How many samples have you tested and so on and so forth. But if you tell them that it is in your Bible or your Quran, your Lord or your Allah or the divine has ordered you to do this and that, they would follow the teachings of that religion. So the convincing power is important. The second one, talking about the hundreds of millions of houses of worship, is the convening power. And every Sunday, every Saturday, every Friday, and other days of the week, these are sacred days for prayers and for paying respect to the Lord and appreciate the creation. So every Friday or every Sunday, a call for prayer is made, Sunday masses or Saturday synagogue meetings and the Friday prayers. So that convening power is a tool that can be utilized to drive the behavior of the people, whether it is on conserving nature, consumption and production patterns, or on peaceful coexistence with others, or unfortunately can be used to divert people from the actual teachings of their religions. So in addition to these two convincing and convening power, there is the economic power that we have spoken about, which is the richness of faith-based organizations. And, research says that they are the fourth largest economic power on earth. That means they own trillions of dollars in investment, whether it is environmentally friendly investments or environmentally destructive investments. That has to be, looked at, and that has to be mobilized or redirected in a transformational way, as Dan mentioned, into financing sustainable development. So these important powers, in addition to the power of presence, faith and religions exist in every corner of the world. Wherever you go, you will find either a house of worship or a religious leader. Those powers cannot be encompassed in any international organization, not even the United Nations. We cannot reach every corner of the world, but religions can. So the mobilization of communities, the projects implementation that Dan talked about on the ground with communities would be easier done by religious organizations. And they can be excellent examples of driving the changes or the transformational changes that we are talking about. For example, we're talking about plastic pollution, and last week we ended the INC meeting on plastic pollution. The religious community in Norway, for example, saw the massive plastic pollution of the coasts of Norway. So what they've decided to do is to collect that plastic and use it constructively to construct an interfaith cathedral. There is now, it was launched 2 years ago, a cathedral for all religions to practice their religions, made all of plastic or reclaimed plastic from the ocean. So these are tremendous examples of mobilizing faith followers to plant trees. There are hundreds of millions of trees that are planted by faith followers and faith organizations. Their important influence on the educational system, as we mentioned, 50% of the schools are owned by organizations. So they have an influence to what they educate people in their schools and how they raise a generation that is connected to the value system that we have been talking about, and to be environmental stewards as called upon by their religion. So there are many excellent examples, and the power of religions is unmatched and should not be underestimated.
Wonderful points. Picking up on where Iyad left off, the strength of the Holy Scripts to guide followers and faith communities, the convening power of religion to bring about positive change. I'm keen to get your perspectives on what ways faith-based organizations engage with and educate their communities on environmental issues. With great power comes great responsibility. So how can they encourage their congregations and communities to take action on environmental causes and participate in nature restoration projects?
I think maybe I should start with a quick step back. Maybe there are those who are not so familiar with the Baha'i community and its approach to its organizational structure. I think as distinct from many other faith communities, there is no clergy in the Baha'i faith, which means that there's a different way by which members of the Baha'i community encourage congregations. I mean, even this notion of congregation is not entirely consistent with many of the approaches that we try to take. So I'll answer this question along two distinct lines that are overlapping. One is the faith itself. And then the second is faith-inspired organizations. Along this first line, there is guidance, of course, that comes from the Baha'i Administrative Order. We elect our administrative leaders at local, national, and then international levels through a democratic process where there's no sort of electioneering or competition. It's done in a prayerful attitude. It's sort of a different example of creating communities of leadership. And each of these bodies that are elected, consisting of 9 members, have responsibility not just to the geographical ambit of the Baha'i community, but also an understanding of the whole community, so members of all faith and no faith, as well as responsibility towards others that are perhaps outside that geographical ambit. And the reason I say all of this is because the vision is one that is meant to be truly world-embracing. And there is guidance that's offered from these administrative assemblies, spiritual assemblies, we call them. So there may be letters from the local spiritual assembly of New York, where I reside, about Climate Week, which is coming up in September, and our engagement in that process. There's also letters from the National Spiritual Assembly about engagement in similar efforts at the national level. And then the Universal House of Justice, which is sort of the global governing body of the Baha'i community. They, every once in a while, will issue a letter that articulates a Baha'i approach to these issues, which involve, anything from, as I mentioned earlier, being anxiously concerned with the needs of the age in which we live, but also non-involvement in partisan politics. And so all of this sort of guides the behavior of adherents to the Baha'i faith and allows them to really contribute to this conversation through action, through words, but also in our activities at the very local level, which are built on this community building process. That's sort of the foundation of what Baha'is everywhere are trying to do. The nature of community building requires that each locality assess its capacities, its needs. And so some communities will look at gender equality as a primary issue. Others will look at race relations, and others the environment, knowing that none of these things exist in a silo, but that they are all interrelated. But as these needs arise, we see, especially among youth, and this isn't just Baha'i youth, this is, all youth in those communities, we see a real desire and aspiration to contribute to the betterment of their community, in so doing the world. And so to the degree that the rest of us who may not fall into that youth dimension can enable those desires and those aspirations to find their highest expression, we see just tremendous changes. We can give examples later, but what it looks like is they assess the needs of their community. They determine a project that they can initiate. They meet with community leaders and elders, and then somehow youth just have a way of making these things happen. And it's really beautiful and exciting. And I find myself learning all the time from their originality and creativity. And so we see this in the natural course of what it is to be a Baha'i. And that's sort of the faith dimension. The second dimension that I think is referenced in your question is about faith-based organizations. Now, the Baha'i faith is rather young. It's not even 2 centuries old at this point. And much of the work of the Baha'i community was inward focused for a long time. Of course, to the best of our ability, it was outward focused, but we have to understand how the faith interacts with the world we see today. But a recent report that I've seen that is publicly available shows the efflorescence of activities around the world. These are individuals and communities inspired by their faith to take either activities of fixed duration or sustained projects, or even to establish Baha'i-inspired organizations. And Baha'i-inspired organizations, again, does not mean it's run and owned solely by Baha'is, but there are many with whom we try to engage. And we see just over the past 25 years, in terms of activities of fixed duration, there were about 1,500 in 1996. Now there's over 100,000. Sustained projects, there were about 240 in 1996. Now there's over 2,000. And even Baha'i-inspired organizations, there were 40 in 1996, and now there's 4 times as many, 170 or so. And so this just to say that there is a role that we can all play, whether it's in our activities of fixed duration, so something, an immediate need we see in our community, a sustained project, something we want to have ongoing for a long period of time. And then we can even establish organizations that are inspired by our faith in order to engage proactively in these issues. And this is, of course, true for all faiths and all beliefs. I just happen to be quite familiar with the Baha'i faith. And so this sort of posture of empowerment and of constructive engagement in these sorts of activities has this multiplier effect where when one group or one community is contributing to the betterment of the world, another sees that and actually wants to engage. It's like a magnetic sort of element. And we see that happening. It's like the spread of a disease, except it's a good one, where good action begets more good action, call it karmic evolution or what have you. But we see this through faith engagement, where the inspiration is not some financial gain. It's not accolades or honorifics. It's really just to make the world a better place. And I think here, this sort of education through action and through example is a really powerful tool that we learn from other faith communities, and we are hoping to contribute to the ongoing and unfolding discourse and action around environmental conservation around the world.
I would say that, first of all, understanding the science and being able to translate that or interpret that with the sacred texts is very powerful for mobilizing and engaging faith congregations and communities. Unfortunately, we know that there are some faith leaders or actors who deny what is going on in regard to biodiversity loss and climate change. And so, as Ihad said earlier, the dialogue around the science is quite important. It's quite important also for shaping what, from a faith perspective, we would call theology that addresses the issues of environmental causes and of restoration work. And that in itself then translates, if you like, on a weekly basis, Saturdays, Sundays, moments of worship in the sermons, which is very powerful for getting a captive audience and getting deep understanding of the issues at heart and what can be done about that, as Dan was saying, practical action. So faith communities, faith-based organizations leading by example. I would say that it's really important that these actions are at local level to begin with, right? Because they are connected. The issues of the environment, of climate change, of biodiversity loss are experienced at that local individual level. And yes, they do translate into global. But the question of how does that connect to our everyday life and our everyday daily practices, how we live, how we eat, how we work, how we transport ourselves, our economic activities, whether we are farming, we're mining, we're involved in industry, or we're even consumers. And so the engagement really and encouraging congregations to take action is very much at that local level to begin with, almost personal and community, but then it can translate more broadly because our congregations comprise people who are engaged in different professions and are able then to use their understanding, their agency in their sphere of control and of influence to begin to make this systemic change that is quite important to turn the trajectory around the planetary issues we're discussing.
From my side, this is an excellent question, but the question talks about how faith organizations can educate their communities, assuming that faith organizations know exactly the relationship between their religions and the environment. While this is true for several faith-based organizations and the leadership of some of the religions, it's not true entirely. So we need to talk about the religion environment literacy and how to make the connections between religions and religious understandings and teachings and values to the contemporary environmental issues that we are talking about. how religion is related to plastic pollution, for example, or how a religion is related to disaster risk reduction or to climate finance. That is not known to most of religious leaders and certainly most of religious followers. So environmental religion literacy is important. And this is one area that UNEP and Faith for Earth, with partners like the Baha'i International Community, like Christian Aid, and many, many others, have been working on. The capacity building, the educational component, the outreach and advocacy. One of the things that we have started doing or started by doing is issuing what we called the Faith for Earth, a call for action textbook, which was launched in the year 2020, based and built on the initial book that we as UNEP launched in the year 2000. However, this revision or this version of the book talks about the contemporary environmental issues that are being discussed at this day and age. So this is a textbook that has been now adopted by a number of universities at the global level as an educational entry point to understanding the relationship between different religions. We tackled more than 15 religions and their understandings on different environmental issues. We have also launched 3 online courses. So far, we have launched 8 online courses. Each course talks about a specific environmental issue, water resources management, for example, climate change, sustainable consumption and production, and so on and so forth. So these are tailored towards the ordinary people, as well as to the decision makers, making the relationship between the values of these religions and the different environmental issues. Also, we have launched a number of strategies to tackle the launch of UN programs. For example, the Decade on the Ecosystem Restoration that was launched in 2020. Immediately the same year, we have launched the Faith Strategy for engaging religious actors and religious communities in the restoration efforts of ecosystems. We have also worked with a number of other organizations and provided guidelines on tree growing, for example. As I mentioned, hundreds of millions of trees have been planted, but the success rate of the plantation of these trees depends on certain conditions, certain type of trees to be planted in certain areas. So we have compiled examples from religions, but also relying on the scientific methods of growing trees. That will contribute to mobilizing and understanding the connections between religions and the environment. So we need to look internally first before we look externally. I mean, we need to assess the amount of knowledge our faith leaders, our religious leaders have in terms of different environmental issues. Are they equipped with a scientific evidence to make the connection in their Sunday masses or Friday prayers? Can they easily talk about such subjects with providing not only the textual sacredness of relevance to that issue, but also depending on what the science is currently saying about it? So environmental and religious literacy is very important, and this will take us way ahead and further steps in mobilizing the faith community in engaging with the triple planetary crisis and relating it to the crisis of poverty, economic development, and so on. Because the economic paradigm that we are adopting today at the global level, at the national level, is a paradigm that focuses on economic gains, but not on the spiritual value of everything around us, and not integrating the value system into the economic paradigm of today. So we need a shift in that paradigm, the general development paradigm, that has to be not only economically beneficial, but also spiritually fulfilling and value-based.
Expanding on this particular topic, it's absolutely critical for the environmental and scientific literature to be aligned with the religious holy scripture, and for faith-based communities to understand the significance of some of these environmental scientific matters clearly. My next question is a very interesting one because it looks at how faith-inspired giving contributes to environmental conservation and restoration. What are some examples of successful faith-inspired giving campaigns that have had a positive impact on the environment? We know for a fact that there are a lot of secular organizations that have used faith-inspired giving for their own campaigns. However, when it comes to the environment, it is genuinely a challenging area for them. We recently had a conversation with Greenpeace, who have looked at this intensely. So they definitely got the scientific part of the equation covered. They definitely have great causes to contribute to. However, they struggled in attracting contributions from certain faith communities because they couldn't align the religious holy scripture with the environmental causes. So keen to hear your thoughts on these two questions. And just to reiterate, how does faith-inspired giving contribute to environmental conservation and restoration? And what are some examples of successful faith-inspired giving campaigns that had a positive impact on the environment?
Thank you. So again, starts with values. What does doing what is right look like? And how do those who want to give from their faith commitment and from their faith understanding of what needs to be different, that starts with the values. So giving to just causes, loving God and neighbor, and in this case, as we're saying, expanding the definition of neighbor, certainly in the Christian faith, to include nature and the environment. If I may give an example from Christian Aid, in the UK, we have more than 250 supporters across churches in the UK. And we obviously engage with them on a regular basis. So we have committed givers, and we also have those who might have started as young people in movements and campaigning. And as they grew older and were able to get a regular income, that becomes regular giving, so committed giving. And we do find as they come into pension and begin to look at life after the earth, that there is the legacy giving. And some of that can run into millions of pounds over time. So there's something about how we connect, not simply with a bowl that says give, but one from our perspective that says give, act, and pray. So connecting faith, connecting those moments in houses of worship with what one can do and what one can give. And we do that as an opportunity for our supporters, as I said, hundreds of thousands, and we know potentially we could actually, just in the UK itself, mobilize millions, and we've estimated up to 7 million supporters, regular givers, people who go to church or even those who don't go to church, but are connected to the faith and want to be able to give. And it's an important opportunity to create awareness. And one of the examples I would give towards COP27, coming out of COP26 that happened in Glasgow, was a campaign that we had around loss and damage. So enlightening our congregations, in this case in the UK, about the damage of climate change that sometimes cannot be repairable, because there's so much flooding, there's so much drought, there's destruction of infrastructure. And when people are able to connect with that, whether it is in the schools, in the young people and their vision for a different world of environmental restoration, and whether it is across the demographics, that ability to mobilize and petitions to members of parliament, influencing government, engaging with other faiths, both within the UK, but also globally, there was a lot of power in that. But the point I want to make is that it's not simply just saying, please give, open your purse or your wallet and give us some money, but it is enabling people to actually see that they can both give financially, but also be part of a movement for change.
Thank you for that, Karimi. There was something you said earlier that I actually wanted to build on a little bit. It helped advance my own thinking when you mentioned that congregants in a faith community are from all different walks of life and different economic and financial circumstances. And as I think about faith-inspired giving, in a way, it can be a leveler in a sense of collective action. That is to say, there is no hierarchy in faith-inspired giving. It doesn't matter if you're rich and giving six figures in US sort of parlance of a large sum, or if you are living with certain material and economic struggles and only giving a very small amount. The fact that it's faith-inspired means that you are doing what you can for a loftier objective. And I think that's quite powerful because in a perfect world, and I know not all faith organizations and all of this, nothing is perfect. But in a perfect world, that sort of giving would then reduce the need for the same types of accountability because you're giving with this sense of trust, this sense of higher order, perhaps aspiration, that you're giving for God, you're giving for the good of all creation. And I think that's different to giving to a certain charity or to a certain cause. Important that is as well. I'm not trying to undermine anything. I'm trying to sort of draw a distinction between faith-inspired giving and its contribution versus other types of giving. One may not support a church or a synagogue because they believe that that is the best church or synagogue. It's the most efficient. It's the dollar for input versus dollar output is the best. It's because it's faith-inspired. And that gives a degree of power and love and detachment that I think has an impact. There's this lovely line that I often return to, which says, every choice we make as employee or employer, producer or consumer, borrower or lender, benefactor or beneficiary, leaves a trace. And the moral duty to lead a coherent life demands that one's economic decisions be in accordance with lofty ideals, that purity of one's aims be matched by the purity of one's actions to fulfill those aims. And this has nothing to do with the number of zeros on your donation. It's about the posture and the behavior that we take. Now, one other element I think is helpful to add for some context is that we speak often about giving, and even I've done so, in terms of dollars and cents. But we also know this irony that plenty of psychological and social studies have demonstrated that actually wealthier individuals proportionately are less giving in a sense. And that's a terrible irony. I wish that we could find a way to reverse that. And of course, it's not universally true. I know that there are wealthy people trying to give away all of their money. God bless them, of course. But I just think about what does it mean to be giving? And there's this example from Vanuatu after Cyclone Pam destroyed one of the islands. And there's this member of a response team who was assessing damage from this cyclone. And he says, as we were approaching the village, we saw 3 youth walking in the opposite direction under a strong sun. We asked where they were going, and they said that they were going to a nearby village to conduct their children's classes and junior youth groups. Later, in the village, we saw that their houses were destroyed and still unbuilt. Now, what that means to me is that they were sacrificing their own need, which was to rebuild their very houses, in preference for giving of their time and their energy to rising generations of children and youth. And I think this kind of impact is really profound, and it changes the nature of what giving is. And it's true in terms of dollars and cents on a ledger. And in terms of the aspiration for expansion of projects and efflorescence of activity at a sort of a fiscal level, it may not seem like much. But in that community, it has a profound impact. It sets an example that we prefer education over our material comforts. I mean, that's an amazing statement. And what that does for that community in terms of galvanize its action then in that sort of reactionary process is really profound. And I'm saying all this not because I think that this answers your question exactly, because I don't have wonderful examples of donors giving of their resources or large campaigns with so many activities resulting from them. But I do know that at the community level, faith can drive us to give of ourselves in ways that are counter to what one would assume are our interests. And that kind of giving has such a positive impact because it encourages others to do so, to become sacrificial, to become the example of their faith, to become the example of then how to respond to the needs of humanity. And whether this giving is of time, of money, of knowledge, of capacity, it doesn't matter, because in a congregation, in a religious community, we have all of those sort of together under one umbrella. And the more we can draw on that strength of our diversity and that strength of our different capacities to give, I think the greater success we have. And we see that time and time again. And again, this is sort of what distinguishes faith-inspired giving from giving. Both are necessary, both are important, but I think that this distinction is important to bear in mind as we're talking about transformation and meeting the needs of humanity where it is today.
And if I may add to all of this, of course, we know that giving is sometimes, for some religions, is actually instituted. So there is a determined amount of your wealth and your products for a year or so, like in Islam and Christianity and Judaism. However, faith-inspired giving in terms of environmental conservation and restoration is something we still are struggling with. And not all people of religious backgrounds believe in the ability to contribute to environmental conservation. However, it is important to know that giving or faith-inspired giving can contribute to funding conservation projects by allocating some portions of these resources in supporting some environmental initiatives. And that can involve projects in terms of restoration, creating wildlife sanctuaries, or preserving ecology in general in sensitive areas. But also, faith-inspired giving extends beyond financial contribution. It also involves promoting sustainable practices within faith communities themselves. So this can include, for example, adopting energy efficient measures, reducing waste, embracing renewable energy sources, and so on. So by setting such examples, faith communities can encourage their members to adopt environmentally conscious behaviors. There are many examples out there at the global and regional level. Of course, Dan and Karimi mentioned some, but for example, the Green Faith movement, they have been mobilizing their congregations to give for environmental causes. The Bhumi Global Project is a Hindu environmental organization, also mobilizing Hindu giving into environmental sustainability. Islamic Relief, it's a humanitarian organization. However, they have started focusing on environmental projects. One of their projects in Kenya, for example, is educating Muslim women on sustainable agriculture. EcoSeek, for example, they have the Million Tree Project campaign, where they have been planting millions of trees based on their givings. But also, there are, as I mentioned, institutional ways that we can think of. For example, zakat and sukuk in Islam. And there are beautiful examples on greening these sukuks by financial institutions like the Islamic Development Bank, like the Dubai Islamic Bank, and others. But also we need to understand that there is a role not only related to financial institutions, but on individuals, like the campaign that we have launched, Faith for Earth, with the World Council of Churches and the Council of New York Rabbis, as well as the Muslim Council of Elders, which is the moral imperative of financial institutions, where the goal of this initiative is to have the shareholders, but even the savers, the individuals who save their money in banks, to utilize their clientele perspectives and engage with CEOs of banks in diverting their investments from fossil fuel or environmentally destructive practices into positive, or what we call the impact investment, where those investments can realize positive impact on the environment. And lastly, the divestment movement that has been flourishing over the past few years. And so far, I believe more than $11 billion by faith-based organizations have been committed to be divested, however, have not yet been able to reinvest in positive impact investment. So that needs a lot of studying, a lot of expertise. And if I divest, where do I invest? What communities, what projects? Because at the end of the day, these investment institutions, they need profits for their investment. So how can I ensure there is a profit for the people and as well as the planet and the private sector itself? So it's a comprehensive area of emerging area. And there are a lot of other examples like the Catholic Climate Movement or Covenant, the Church of England. They have a special program on environmental investment in their institution as well as in supporting projects on the ground.
That's such a fascinating topic. We actually had a conversation recently with an amazing organization called Faith Invest, and they offer guidance to faith-based organizations on how to deploy their funds and invest their funds in a manner that is compliant with the religious scripture, with the holy text, and most importantly, the spiritual values of the faith. And there are, as you mentioned right at the beginning of our episode today, there are trillions of dollars of assets in this space. And faith-based organizations do have a huge role and responsibility to ensure that these investments and these assets are managed in a manner that is compliant, not only with the faith principles, but also in a manner that is friendly to the environment and supports environmental conservation and restoration. What role can the investment funds and endowments of faith-based organizations play in restoring nature? And how can these organizations ensure that their investments align with their environmental values and principles?
Building on what we have just mentioned, the investment funds and endowments of faith-based organizations can play a crucial role in restoring nature. We need to start with aligning those investments with the environmental values and principles of the concerned religions. So what can be done? First of all, we need to bring to the play what we call ethical investment policies, which are being adopted by some commercial banks. However, we have the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative that engages hundreds of commercial banks and have come up with financial principles for banking, for investment, and for pensions. We only have one faith-based organization, institution, or bank as member of the Finance Initiative among the hundreds of other commercial banks. So we need to start by applying those ethical investment policies within these religious or faith-inspired institutions. Again, also what we can do is do sort of what we call environmental screening and due diligence of programs and projects and environmental practices of these financial institutions related to religions and faith institutions, and to assess the risks of investment on people, the planet, and based on their teachings. We can start with people working in these investment institutions, like engaging with investment managers. Everywhere you go, whether it is a private sector CEO or it is a CEO of a bank, they all relate to a religion. So start from those in power in these positions and engage with them to ensure that they themselves, as individuals, but powerful individuals in powerful places, they adopt environmental values based on their religions and their faith. Again, impact investment and divestment is humongous. It is a growing movement and it offers opportunities. You mentioned Faith Invest, for example. They're doing a great job in collecting the financial values of religions, though there are not many, because religions have not studied that from the principles of religions, and now we are working with them to relate that to their value system. But there are examples that are very important and can be utilized for positive impact investment. You have important multilateral funds that have established criteria for positive impact investment. For example, the Green Climate Fund or the Global Environment Facility. Those can be vehicles and tools for those who want to redirect their investments into impact investment based on their values and religions. I mentioned the Green Sukuk, for example. There are banks in Malaysia, one bank called the Tadau Energy Bank, only funds renewable energy projects. They started in 2017. Even owners of supermarket chains, for example, in UAE and the Middle East, they have established Green Sukuk in 2019, and they do invest back in greening the portfolio of their company. And last example, again, maybe from the Islamic faith, is the Bank al-Muamalat in Indonesia, where they have issued Green Sukuk specifically to support environmental friendly projects and allocating these financial resources to renewable energy projects, which will minimize carbon emissions, will minimize destruction of biodiversity, and will provide, off-grid energy resources to remote areas and villages where it is impossible with little and no financing to reach. So you're providing futuristic aspects or opportunities for remote communities with such energy systems. So there are good examples, but they remain good examples. And what we need is scaling up and escalating these to become the norm rather than being examples and models. We need all banks to have green banking systems, and this is why the UN Secretary General has launched the greening financing campaigns and have met with CEOs of commercial banks at the global level to make the environmental and climate emergency an emergency and a risk factor in financing by those commercial banks.
Thank you, Iyad, for starting us off. I think your examples are excellent. And I think that summary where you said, let these be not examples, but the norm, is exactly where we want to go. Perhaps just to add two quick dimensions, Iyad, I think, has provided sufficient examples. One is just to acknowledge this fundamental tension between return on investment and environmental values. There are, of course, profitable green investment opportunities, but the standard practice in terms of return on investment is one that just follows certain principles on quarterly returns and interest rates and all of these sort of material dimensions. And that tension actually extends even further when you have declining enrollments in faith, declining congregations. How does a church stay afloat when its membership is going down and it needs to maximize its return on investment. It's hard. And there are these principles in economics and in investing that are not guided by environmental sustainability. And I suspect that if they were to be so, it probably would end up aligning and we would actually be able to make more return on investment because we could reduce fossil fuel subsidies and all of these elements that we know are actually constraining the green impact that could be had. But that fundamental tension, I think, needs to be acknowledged because there are many principles at hand. If a church is running out of funds, it needs to return its investment as high to maximize that return on investment, to keep its doors open, to keep itself staffed. Now you have competing values. There's the value of the existence of the church, and there's the value of environmental sacredness, so to speak. And I don't envy those who are in those positions of tension. But what I will say, in addition to the fact that I think this is a false dichotomy, there are some market forces that have shifted the game in a way that is not consistent with either the fundamental values of capitalism, if we want to believe in capitalism, that would remove some of this money from subsidizing things that shouldn't be subsidized. But also, I just think we need to be very holistic in our understanding of these various tensions, and that will be important. The other dimension I wanted to just add is that there is more than money here in terms of the role of investment funds and endowments. There is trust and trustworthiness. I think a faith community that invests its financial resources in principled investments, green climate funds and what have you, may indeed return less on its investment materially, but it will return more on its investment in terms of that moral authority, which faiths often claim. And in order to claim that moral authority, one has to be acting upon it. And yes, this area of research and of economic activity is rather nascent, unfortunately, in terms of finding those companies that align with our values. And it's not just environmental values. It's also gender equality. It's also protection of minorities. There are many different dimensions to aligning our investment with our values, and it gets really complicated and difficult. However, there has to be this sort of moral stance taken that says we may sacrifice a little bit of our material gain in order to have that principled high ground that says we are doing the right thing, even though we may not be doing the most profitable thing, financially profitable thing. And that's a mind shift that runs contrary to many of the dominant narratives in society, to which religions also succumb. So I think we have to acknowledge all of these different dimensions, and with that, encourage further investment in the types of examples that Iyad has presented.
If I may add, I think we've all agreed that there are trillions of dollars that investment funds and endowments have, faith-based have. And for me, the question becomes, what types of investments are being made? So there is almost the traditional way or the conventional way that is not necessarily faith-inspired. But the question then would be, what opportunities are there? And it comes from being well-informed, having good awareness of nature, of environmental issues beyond, in my view, ESG. So there is a huge role, in my perspective, that well-informed, faith-based organizations can actually make and influence investments towards restoring nature from the role of the environment and the stewardship responsibility. So it begins by understanding that nature has intrinsic value, as Dan was saying, beyond a financial return. And therefore going beyond some of the due diligence on exclusions, not investing in tobacco, alcohol, or gambling, or fossil fuels, but also to appreciate that this investment is not necessarily a financial return in the short run, but an understanding that environmental restoration is an absolute driver for what economies, people and planet look like going forward? What needs to change? Which biodiversity and climate change are telling us we must go into a different trajectory. So where it comes to faith-based organizations and the investment capital that they have, again, I keep talking about stewardship here, stewardship of financial resources and what role that plays in environmental restoration. So it's also about diversifying portfolios beyond stocks, bonds, and, traditional areas for investment, thinking outside the box, being willing to take risk where it comes to innovation, where it comes to social enterprises that have a tangible impact that shifts society, that shifts the trajectory of where we are going, and having within their range of portfolio environment and nature higher up that range. So we've seen great examples of investments that have been made in affordable housing, so addressing issues of homelessness, for example, addressing issues of healthcare, education, and investments that have been made through faith-based investment. And finally, I would say the need then to unpack risk. So it's not just simply about high returns and here financial returns and looking at low risk, but actually saying, what does it look like to invest in the future of our planet? So taking a long-term view and investments that are catalytical, right? That encourage innovation. Yes, there'll be failure, there'll be learning, but within that portfolio that allows for impact from the perspective of being catalytic and playing a significant role, because, we're talking about significant assets here, right? From a financial point of view, but the importance of how those are used for systemic change.
Fascinating insights that undoubtedly would have a huge impact and definitely be a tipping point for some of the organizations that are tuning in. So for our final question, how can faith-based organizations work with other stakeholders, such as government, businesses, NGOs, to create a collective impact for environmental restoration? Are there any successful examples of such partnerships and initiatives that you could discuss from your own organizations? How basically do you want to engage with our audience?
Thanks very much, Wahid. Very quickly to say, it's very, very important that all stakeholders work together. What we have at stake, where the world needs to get to by 2030, in order that by 2050, we have stemmed the challenge that climate change and biodiversity loss pose for society. It's extremely important that this is about cross-sector partnerships, and it's what everyone brings to the table. What does, as we've been discussing today, faith actors, faith communities, faith institutions bring to the table, what government brings to the table, what businesses bring to the table, what civil society brings to the table. Everyone has a role to play and a responsibility, and with a sense of urgency. We may not necessarily all share the same values, but we do share the same planet, and we do have a responsibility across all these sectors to move with speed so that generations to come can enjoy a planet where human beings and nature or creation, as some of us would call it, one that is thriving, that's about well-being, that's about prosperity for all, that's about peace. And so working with stakeholders, other stakeholders, in my view, shouldn't be a debate. It should be, let's get to work, let's roll up our sleeves.
Thanks so much. In addition to what Karimi mentioned, perhaps I can just provide a brief example of what this may look like on the ground. And it may sound like it's only an on-the-ground example, but in fact, it is this kind of dialogue and consultation that can lead to better solutions at all levels. So there is this example, the Caribbean island of Dominica was struck by Hurricane Maria. And after this hurricane, some in the community were coming together to have dialogue and, in fact, prayer to help the community try to recover. And they actually determined that there were two lines of action that they wished to pursue. And I found this very interesting because it's not something that the traditional international donor might imagine would be the lines of action. The first was the need to build greenhouses to reestablish food crops that had been destroyed. And they used locally available materials. This is not coming in from outside, including land donated by community members, even damaged elements of previously existing structures. And they came together and they actually built these sort of secondhand greenhouses. But after the full day of building these greenhouses, they would reflect and pray and study and think together about the needs of the community. Another need identified was this need to return their children to a sense of normalcy. Their children wear uniforms when going to school. And so they decided that they needed uniforms. And a government official heard that this was something that was of necessity. And there was a big conversation about whether it was uniforms they needed or not. Not because they may not need them, but because the community members themselves knew how to sew. So all they really needed was cloth. They just needed material. And the government official who was listening in said, listen, we've had an influx of financial resources. If you can source the cloth, I will pay you to make these uniforms for your children. And so this partnership developed that nobody would have predicted, I would imagine, from the outside, saying, oh, after a hurricane, what's necessary is the cloth for uniforms for children. But in fact, that sense of normalcy, that regular pattern was really important to the social fabric of the community. And I find that's the type of partnership and that's the type of creative solution that comes about when you have a faith-based conversation from within that community itself. And I think that those types of partnerships and creative thinking are really a strength of faith-based communities around the world, including at international levels. When we're talking about, as you were saying earlier, Wahid, when we're talking about those investors who may be listening in, donors who may be listening in, it's about developing this consultative spirit where we don't come in with the solutions, but we come in seeking solutions. And then we work together to find how best to use our collective strengths, as Karimi was referencing, in order to meet the moment.
Well, thank you, Wahid, for this question, which is an existential question for Faith for Earth Coalition at the United Nations Environment Programme. This is exactly why we were created. It's to facilitate dialogue and interaction between faith, different religions, but also with other stakeholders. Let us also remember that Goal 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals is about stakeholder participation and the role of private sector, individuals, and everybody in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So our existence, our main objective is to facilitate interfaith dialogue, but also dialogue with policymakers, as I started when I presented the Faith for Earth and our goals. So making that platform, the Faith for Earth platform, to engage with all stakeholders. Every 2 years, we hold the United Nations Environment Assembly, which is our governing body, and we launched the Faith for Earth dialogue sessions. For example, the past 2 environmental assemblies, we have organized more than 25 sessions each time. Last time, we had around 700 participants, representing 90 religions and congregations from 190 countries, representing with the contribution of more than 190 speakers from different religions, from different NGOs, politicians, faith leaders, and so on. So the Faith for Earth is a platform to engage with everybody, all stakeholders. Our purpose is to provide guidance and support. And guidance, it's not that we know it all. Guidance is extracted from the knowledge, the practices of our partner organizations. So we don't work in silo, but we engage and learn from the examples with other organizations. For example, we have partnered with the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology, and we have established a platform where we can capture the contributions of faith-based organizations into the different sustainable development goals. And so far, we have issued 3 reports on how successful faith-based organizations and local communities have been in contributing to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Our main objective is to amplify the voices and contribute to the advocacy of faith players and faith actors at the intergovernmental levels, where policymakers, politicians, presidents, and heads of states meet. And we have been successful in doing so in a number of intergovernmental meetings, such as Stockholm Plus 50, such as the COP26, 27, and now we are leading the operations or faith engagement for COP28, COP15 in Montreal, where substantive contributions from faith-based organizations and faith actors have been submitted and statements have been made to the policymakers. And that never existed before without the contribution of like-minded faith-based organizations who have adopted the environment as a pillar in their work. So there are so many excellent stories of collaboration between faith organizations and other stakeholders.
Today's conversation has illuminated the profound ways that faith and nature are intertwined. As we face the mounting challenges of climate change and environmental degradation, the role of faith-based organization in restoring nature is more critical than ever. We hope you found this session insightful. We would like to take this opportunity to thank you, our audience, for tuning in, our speakers for giving us your valuable time and sharing your insights with our audience, our support team, and our partners, including Catalyst 2030. Goodbye.